I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the European Foundation for Democracy for this webinar that focuses on the issue of disinformation that has been exponentially triggered by the recent or ongoing COVID-19 crisis. This is an event that we are organizing jointly with the US mission to the European Union. We have three great speakers who look at the situation of the media from different perspectives. I would like to introduce Barbara Trionfi, who's Executive Director of the International Press Institute based in Vienna, and who has a broad perspective, particularly when it comes to liaising and understanding the context and the situation of from the point of view of journalists worldwide. Bojan Pancevski, who's the Wall Street Journal correspondent based in Berlin, who, for those who have been following his work, has observed in detail the recent and ongoing response from certainly from Europe on the COVID-19 crisis, but also on the role of media. And last but not least, Nadezhda Azhgikhina, based in Russia, who's also is a journalist and director of PEN Moscow. As a journalist, she will share with us her perspective, her experience on the phenomenon and the issues of fake news and disinformation more in general. For terms of housekeeping, this discussion is going to last for about 1 hour. If the at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you have the ability to ask questions by raising your hand. Questions will be taken after the brief overview from our speakers. I think I've said everything. The webinar, the discussion is on the web and is currently live also on Facebook. Bojan, I would like to start with you. If you can, as I was saying, you followed closely the pandemic and the response, both of governments and individual citizens or media, and different, a whole range of actors. My question to you is really, what do you see that is new compared to crisis in the past? How this phenomenon of disinformation has gained such a relevance, and what kind of response have you seen, or measures have you seen in terms of addressing and deconstructing disinformation in general?
Thank you. Well, at first, I'd like to say that this phenomenon of disinformation is really nothing new, and especially not in the sense of state actors or some sort of rogue political groups, or not rogue. You know, they used to call it propaganda back in the days, and disinformation was part of a propaganda strategy. For example, the Soviet Union in the 80s had a very elaborate disinformation campaign about the virus HIV that causes AIDS. And the disinformation campaign, which was revealed recently in historic documents after archives were opened, aimed at kind of showing that the United States had somehow produced the virus in a lab and released it with nefarious sort of intentions. So, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. What is new, however, is that this type of messaging is amplified manifold by the actual media that are now available. And by that, I mean social networks, basically Facebook and YouTube for the most part. So more than ever now, you know, Marshall McLuhan's The Medium is the Message is a sort of a very valid point at the moment, because through these means people are receiving information which is neither fact checked nor true for most of it, I guess, related to the epidemic in the recent days. And yet they consume this as they would consume normal media. So I think that's the, like, if you want to postulate the essential problem here, that's the problem. We have this enormous network of digital publishing, which is Facebook, YouTube, etc. And there's absolutely no regulation or control. There's no fact checking. There's nobody probes the quality of it. Nobody is responsible for it. It's just out there, and anyone can use it. Be it a sort of a rogue government or a government with intentions of creating a campaign to disinform a certain public, or just sort of individual nut jobs who don't perhaps have a political agenda but suddenly gain some influence. Now, going back to your specific question, for me, this was quite interesting because at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this sort of, which I as a journalist call a blissful silence. You know, all the partisan bickering stopped. All the sort of disinformation or information, political messaging stopped because people didn't know what was happening. They were afraid. You know, there was a new thing. There was this virus spreading at great speed. It wasn't clear how deadly it is. People were just worried. Governments were worried. Politicians on all ends of the spectrum were worried. And therefore, there was a sort of a silence in the sense of this typical polarization that we're now seeing resurrected. So that lasted for a few weeks. And it had ongoing quiet, and people were just listening to experts such as virologists or epidemiologists or mathematicians telling us how this thing spreads, what are the odds, and advising governments what to do. So there was a moment where actual expert opinion reigned. And then obviously things, as people got used to it, and as the pandemic progressed and it's perhaps less sort of pronounced in some countries, then we returned to the old polarization that we have had before. Now only it comes with a vengeance. So basically now people discuss this even in the most mainstream of forums. They discuss this with a partisan sort of thinking in the back of their heads. Basically, it's where you stand politically is where you stand on the epidemic. Quite often that is the case. Politicians, officials, commentators, perhaps the media, even individual media outlets are taking a stance based on their ideology, based on their politics. As for actual specific disinformation, it has run amok in the past few weeks, ever since this sort of, there was a slight relief when people realized they're not going to die and the world is not coming to an end. And then everything returned to normal. So there are very elaborate disinformation campaigns about the virus. There are some sort of completely absurd conspiracy theories. If you recall, for many years, George Soros, the sort of Wall Street billionaire, has been a target of many conspiracy theory about his actions and what his influence in the world. And now that role has been passed on to Bill Gates, the Microsoft founder, and now he's a philanthropist and spending his billions on sort of public health issues. And it's very interesting to see. Initially, it was a kind of a bizarre little theory that he had started all this, and now it has snowballed into actually political groups parroting what was written on the internet. So that's quite worrying. I haven't obviously researched this that thoroughly, but it would appear that some of the disinformation that we're seeing now is actually quite organized and quite systematic. I mean, there are specific conspiracy theories that sort of repeat themselves with regards to the origin of the virus, with regards to the purpose of the virus being spread, with regards to the purpose of the lockdowns and the government measures, etc. I don't want to repeat all that because it's quite outlandish, but it does seem that there is a symptom behind the outlandishness and behind the madness. So it wouldn't be surprising if there was a sort of a state actor perhaps, or a political group spreading some of this in certain Western countries, because it adds to the general polarization in societies that we're seeing perhaps across the board. Certainly Great Britain over Brexit, and in the United States over President Trump, in Germany to an extent over migration, and so on. So you have to stop me at some point because
I'll stop you now. Thank you, Bojan. It's very interesting comment, and we'll follow up on those. There's one point you mentioned, and that is that some of the measures taken are well, there aren't many measures really taken. There's no real legislation. And I'd like to specifically targeting or addressing the issue of disinformation, if that's what I understood correctly. But I'd like to jump here to Nadezhda, because in Russia, there is new legislation, new laws have been new rules have been introduced to stop and prevent fake news and disinformation. Nadezhda, if you can comment on this, is it working? What is your perspective? What is the response?
Good afternoon. I am glad to participate in this discussion, what is very important, and I would like to share with you some short information from Russia. Russia is not the only country what has a special legislation about fake news during pandemic. I should say that we already had legislation, special law devoted to fake news, which became true last autumn. It was strongly criticized by European colleagues, by Article 19 and all experts. Unfortunately, there was no discussion about it. And according to this law devoted to fake news, it was anti-fake news law, fake news which provide damage for public infrastructure, to public health, to some disorder in society, must be banned. And the only institution to do that was the General Prosecutor Office. The question was how General Prosecutor Office could analyze everything, but it was a law. Of course, it was a easy tool for censorship, but this spring, this law was amended with a special chapter devoted to virus, and unfortunately, it was moved from administrative code to criminal code, and those who provide fake news about virus, which is not clear, definition is not clear, could face fines up to 23,000 euros and up to 5 years in prison. It was very strict, it was very strange. It was accepted immediately without any discussion like it happens in Russia. And it is real threat to freedom of expression. And as a result, we face, on one hand, lack of proper information from physicians, from hospitals. Physicians are afraid to give information about real situation. On another hand, we faced enormous amount of criminal cases. So the most important in this legislation is that it is not only for journalists, it's for everybody, spreading information online. And what our top expert in media law, Galina Arapova, says, that the impression is that investigative agencies are ready to write up a report on anyone who expresses an opinion or distributes information that does not agree with the official points of view. And as a result, we have several cases. One of those cases, we report on it, and we made a statement about Tatiana Volskaya, journalist and pen St. Petersburg member from St. Petersburg who made a report from a hospital, and she was targeted as a fake maker by investigators, and chief investigator approached her in St. Petersburg. She didn't, because she didn't want to open her resource. According to the law, she has a right not to open her resource, but it happened, and we are waiting for the result. Another famous case, we have dozens of cases from all over Russia, but another case is about Elena Milashina from Novaya Gazeta, a well-known opposition independent newspaper, about violations of rights of ill people in Chechnya. Chief of president of Chechnya threatened her, literally, in his resource in Instagram, and there was no real response for that. And another moment is that our deputies try to promote new legal initiatives like amendment to anti-extremism law. They several days ago, they suggested to amend this anti-extremist law, which is criticized a lot because the definition of extremism is very unclear, very vague, with a special point, punishment for justification of extremism. What does it mean? There is no clarification what it is. And Chief of Mass Media Defense Center Galina Arapova says that it would be simple way to punish everybody expressing independent opinion. It's very dangerous. It's a real threat for freedom of expression, and it should be reacted, of course. So we face these clear attempts to shut up independent voices, to arrange new form of censorship, and the most serious concern of journalists and human rights activists in Russia is that, okay, it's pandemic, it's extreme situation, everybody is very neurotic, and it's special, we are not expected this situation, but the most important is that those extreme measures should not be alive after that pandemic. And of course, many people think that those restrictions for media freedom could have much longer life than pandemic itself. So it should be monitored, it should be reacted, it should be, it should disappear from our life. It's not very easy. I should say that implementation of legislation in Russia is a special case. Implementation is very selective, and today all our colleagues call for release of our journalist and deputy of Moscow city government Azar, who has been detained for single picket during pandemic. He was detained for 15 days. It's total violation of constitution because single pickets are allowed during all time. And he was detained because he violated so-called order of Moscow mayor about behavior during pandemic, which contradicts our constitution. And number of journalists went to pickets to protect him, to support him. Many of them have been detained and released, but still now we do demand his release, and it's our practice for today.
Barbara, I would like to move to you, and while doing so, I also would like to apologize because actually in my introduction I forgot, I was so focused on the technicalities of the webinar that I forgot to mention that this webinar is actually organized jointly also with the International Press Institute. I just took you for granted. Barbara, what we've heard from Bojan and Nadia, on one hand, there's no legislation, there's no legal frameworks for really effectively prevent and neutralize this form of the use and misuse of disinformation, fake news, and so on and so on. But on the other hand, legislation can easily be seen as a form of censorship or can easily be abused by illiberal systems. So I actually have two questions for you. One is how are measures to prevent disinformation being perceived from the media, from journalists in the field that you work with, you're in contact with? And second, that is to you, but in fact is open to all our panelists, how can liberal democracies introduce legislation while staying liberal democracies, while respecting the values and the principle of liberal democracies? Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta, and thank you for inviting IPI to join this important conversation. Yeah, no, indeed. In terms of you know, the statement that there are no legislations in place to limit disinformation, I would partially disagree with that, in the sense that it's true, there are no effective legislation that limit disinformation, but there are a number of countries that over the past years, and more recently in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, have passed legislation specifically targeting fake news, or supposed to target fake news. IPI has been, since the beginning of the pandemic, IPI has started collecting information about press freedom violations linked to the COVID-19 pandemic, meaning different ways in which governments and other actors have acted in order to limit journalists' ability to disseminate accurate information about the pandemic. And with the ultimate goals that we have seen from governments from the very early stage of the pandemic to control the message. And we have seen this in more and less democratic countries across the world. In this context, specifically looking at supposed anti-fake news laws, we have recorded 16 countries around the world that have passed new laws to target specifically information related to, supposedly disinformation related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And this 16 adds to numerous other countries that had fake news, anti-fake news laws in place before, and that used their laws to limit journalistic coverage. Now, as Nadia has explained very well, in all cases that IPI has been monitoring, the anti-fake news laws have been used actually to limit legitimate reporting on the pandemic. It has been used mostly by government that have repressive government or others that have shown an interest in controlling the message to do precisely that, to limit critical reporting about government policies, about even questioning the numbers that government agencies would disseminate about the pandemics and so on. So the effect of anti-fake news laws in the context of the pandemic that we have observed has been precisely the opposite, has been limiting journalism ability to counter disinformation. And this brings me to your second question: what can we do? What are the democratic tools that we have to counter disinformation? From IPI's point of view, and IPI is a network of editors and journalists dedicated to the promotion of press freedom as well as quality journalism. So from our point of view, the only legitimate tool to counter disinformation is journalism. So what we have seen in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also before, whenever a society is confronted with disinformation campaigns, and as has been said before, most of these campaigns are organized. There is an entity behind, typically linked to governments, to political parties, or to others in power. Whenever a society is confronted with this type of information, what they need is quality information to counter it. What they need is more journalism. And journalists, certainly many of our members, have been also changing, if you want, the way they do their work in order to ensure that on one hand, they check that their fact checking is extremely developed and accurate to ensure that none of the disinformation that circulates on social media and elsewhere enters the news. So there is a lot of work that is being done by journalists in order to fact check. On the other hand, however, journalists have done a lot of work to explain to their audiences why they can trust certain sources, being journalistic sources. In doing this, there is a lot of work done by news media to explain how certain information is being gathered, basically how the journalistic process works, taking audiences behind the scenes to give that level of trust that audiences need in order to trust journalistic sources rather than other sources that they may find, that people may find on social media and elsewhere. Now, the problem in all this is that, and it's also a phenomenon that IPI has studied very much, the other side of the same phenomenon is online harassment. So online harassment of journalists is the other side of disinformation. So while on one hand, there are disinformation campaigns being disseminated, on the other hand, there are campaigns targeting journalists aimed primarily at challenging their credibility in the public arena. So hate campaigns targeting journalists and smear campaigns against them, basically arguing that journalists are not credible sources and so on. So journalists have found themselves forced to deal with this complexity of the environment whereby if they do their work in challenging disinformation, it is most likely that they will become the targets of hate campaigns online. I'll leave it there for now, but I'm happy to take more questions. I think there is a lot to further elaborate on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Barbara. Yes, there's certainly a lot, and I have a few questions that come to my mind. Certainly, quality journalism, more journalism. Where do you draw the line? No, that's not correct. Where do you draw the line? How do you define quality? Because we've had, as Bojan said, propaganda, disinformation is nothing new. We've seen it in the past, and actually we've seen in our countries, not in authoritarian systems, also a very odd disinformation campaign that target in specific sectors or individuals or phenomena and so on. So how do you make sure that we have more but qualitative journalists as a response? And the other one, when I move back to Bojan, is on propaganda, and is relevant probably for all of you. Yes, we've always had propaganda. There's a very interesting piece in Politico Europe today about what appear to be very clearly Russian and Chinese states, government officials or diplomats bombarding the social media world with the tweets and messages attacking the situation in the US. And that's very interesting how these particular two countries have been focusing during COVID and now in a crisis situation on pushing further disinformation messages. I don't know who wants to come. Maybe Barbara, I don't know if you have a few more words on the quality of media, and then Bojan following up on propaganda.
Sure. How do you define quality? I think is a question that many of us have tried to answer. I think in the end we need to remember, we need to keep in mind that journalism is a profession, and and Bojan and Nadia can explain that better than me, being practicing the profession. You know, there are tools that journalists use to ensure that the information is verified, to ensure that there are different sources, to ensure that the sources that journalists approach are the right ones, are trusted ones, are you know, and to offer the type of, and I really want to call it quality information that we all need. So I think that part of the effort that I mentioned before to bring the audience behind the scene and show how journalism is done is precisely to explain why the type of information that you can find on the Wall Street Journal or on quality news or organizations and so on is more credible than those that you may find on Facebook or on certain sources on Facebook, you know. So I think that there is something, again, that we need to accept that there is something that there are facts, and that there is fact-based journalism. We cannot become so cynical to believe that, you know, every opinion and every supposed fact is equally worthy. So in that sense, a major effort of journalism is why they can trust us, and to build that type of relationship in the sense of saying, you're not going to trust me because you believe I support the same ideology that you believe. That doesn't matter. You're going to trust me because I'm showing you how I do my work. And in that sense, I think that, as I said, there is a lot of work to be done, but I do think that we need to make sure that we don't lose that trust by becoming cynical.
Thank you. Bojan, going back to propaganda, yes, we've seen it in the past. In a way, Europe has been familiar with propaganda aimed at destabilizing the European elections and so on, coming particularly from Russia. But is China a new form of propaganda? Have we seen it before? Do you see differences? And then in the meantime, well, as you answer this, participants can start asking questions using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. Bojan, to you.
Yes, well, I agree with everything Barbara said. I think, however, it's quite challenging to educate media consumers, or anyone really who is interested in news and the reality around us, to be more trustful of the mainstream media. I mean, alone this formulation, mainstream media, or MSN, as you will see on social media, is sort of it's become emblematic for something bad, wrong, for a conspiracy, for something not to be trusted. And people gather around sort of random websites or podcasts or chat groups or stuff they see on Facebook, and they sort of, there's a whole segment of the population which I think is kind of lost actually to the mainstream media. They don't, especially now that newspapers like my newspaper are behind a paywall, so you have to pay some money to get access to it. And I think most people will just choose not to, because there is no, first thing, there is no real habit, ingrained habit, especially not among younger people, to pay for media, to pay for the news, because everything is free and there's so much you can find on the internet which you don't have to pay for. Also quality media like The Guardian and the BBC, for example, you don't have to pay for those. You know, then you have the problem of access, and then you have the problem of this sort of ingrained thinking that the truth is out there. But the truth is not out there, and as Barbara said, journalism is a profession. You know, if you want to report on a war somewhere happening at the moment, you know, in Syria or in East Ukraine, you can't rely on someone saying something on an obscure website and you don't know who they are and you don't know what they're doing. But it turns out people do rely on that because it's cheap, it's easy, there's a good soundbite, and it spreads virally over, you know, for example, Facebook or YouTube. Whereas for our newspaper to send someone down, that would mean a whole procedure. It's quite expensive. They have to be trained for, you know, sort of a war zone reporting, et cetera, et cetera. You know, there's a whole logistic issue. And you know, I agree. It would be great if we could educate the broader public into the workings of the legacy media. You know, how complicated, how sort of how resourceful we have to be in doing this, and that there are actual standards and editing layers, and that, you know, filters, and that rubbish and fake news will not really necessarily make the cut in a legacy medium. But I think we're kind of losing the battle because it's out there. There is a whole network for free of social media where people can instantly sort of hook on to any kind of idiotic conspiracy, which, if it's presented nicely, people may believe it. And I see this every day, for example, now with the pandemic. So I think it's a little bit difficult. Basically, Facebook, YouTube, etc. It's like, you know, you have a public that wasn't professionally aware of how the media works, and perhaps not that interested in consuming much of it. And, you know, you can compare them to someone having a sort of a nice old little Beetle Volkswagen, and then comes Facebook in this whole new culture, which is basically a Lamborghini, and you give this Lamborghini without the brakes. And then Facebook says, well, we're not a media company. We don't have to put in the brakes into the car. We're not actually producers of this. We're just a platform. We provide access to it, but it's not our product, so we don't have to worry about it. And then people don't really, you know, they are encircled with this sort of avalanche of news and impressions and information, which, you know, for much of it is rubbish. And I don't know, it's a huge policy challenge how to deal with that, but essentially there will be some regulation needed, I guess, because otherwise it will be difficult. You know, anyone can put something out on social media, and it will be consumed perhaps much more than it would be on my newspaper's website. And as for China specifically, I'm not an expert, but it's quite interesting that during the pandemic we saw China really take initiative after the first month or so, when the epidemic subsided in their own country. They started these sort of they started a bid to control the message, because essentially the pandemic originated in China. It started there, that's beyond dispute. But then you had even the foreign minister of China and other officials spreading this sort of vague conspiracies that it didn't actually start there. It hadn't been originating in China, but how it was somewhere in the West, and sort of suggesting there is a murky type of conspiracy behind it. And these are senior officials, state officials. And then what happened was they also tried to take control of the messaging in the sense of this humanitarian aid campaign that they unleashed. They started sending masks and other material to struggling European countries such as Italy, such as Spain. And they cut a deal with Germany for supplying high quality personal protection equipment for medics and others who need that. So I think it has been perhaps a watershed moment for China in that sense, because we haven't seen them really so openly, actively, and successfully venture into the global arena with this enormous forceful bid to take hold of the message and try to shape it according to their political interests. Although, as I said, I think there's a little dispute in the scientific community that the virus actually originated in China, and we still don't know how. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I'll start taking some of the questions. There are quite a few questions coming from the audience. I'd like to start. I'll take them a bit together, but one is very clear. It's from Gary Cartwright, who's wondering whether where is the line, or do we see the line blurring between what is media and information and journalism in general and lobbying, and whether this situation has opened the door to those interests that seek to plant fake news. Have you, what do you see as it's interesting because Bojan, you mentioned cars, you went from politics to very practical examples. Do you see that this as an issue? This applies to all, the question. Do you see this as an issue or not so much?
Well, look, I think perhaps it's an issue. I'm speaking without knowing this at all and without actually wanting to claim anything, but I think it could be an issue with smaller outlets who are struggling for income, and perhaps podcasts, and perhaps, you know, little websites that have some following, but they don't have resources or much staff, and perhaps they have to rely more on sort of advertising, perhaps on speaking on behalf of some lobbying outfits. I can imagine for some sort of more or less alternative outfits this to be an issue, but for the bigger I think legacy media, I don't think so. I mean, it's a fact obviously that a lot of media in the world is struggling financially because you know, all of us are struggling to find the right model, because the old model obviously is not working, and not everyone has really adjusted to the digital era and to all the things that it brings with it. So I think for sure that is an issue, and will increasingly be an issue, because you know, in the country where I come from, Macedonia, you know, most media, you know, most journalists are broke, so that, you know, it's quite difficult to even find a proper job and find a proper medium that will pay proper salaries. And obviously that environment is not necessarily conducive to good media literacy, to good journalism, to good coverage of things. And I think that's the case across the board. Certainly, you know, in countries like Slovakia, the same thing is happening in Hungary, not to mention Russia, obviously, where the state plays a role. So I think, yeah, I think this will be an issue as you know, as media outlets run out of money and sources of revenue.
Two more questions that I'm coming from our audience. One is education, the role of education. What kind of role can education play in shaping and strengthening critical thinking, and how are schools empowered to deal with this? And the other one, on the other side of the spectrum, again, social media platforms, how we use them. At the same time, we mentioned legislation. What do you see as the role of social media platforms in terms of taking responsibility in verifying what they broadcast or circulate? And particularly, one of the question is your perspective on US administration measures focus on social media.
I do believe that education is a principal issue. Education in general and media literacy. Unfortunately, in Russia, we have some projects, we have some brilliant programs and courses, but they are not implemented enough. But it is clear that without media literacy and media education in general, we cannot go forward. unfortunately, we face situation when connection between general audience and the media, general audience and journalists is broken. People do not trust now, they trust more social media. They trust more internet than general media. They try to, people try to find media they trust, but it's not easy. And education about use of internet, social media, media in general, doesn't exist. And it's clear that education should and must and play a crucial role in development of society, development of our civil society and civil initiatives and human rights and general human rights agenda in general. It is clear that we must have media literacy for young generation, for kids, for teenagers, and even for state officials to explain that media freedom is important for our general development, because people are not aware. And it's a pity that even people with the education more or less aware in the general stuff, they do not know how to deal with the media, how to choose what to do, and so on. I do believe that we have very good resource here, and it's very important.
Thank you. Would you like to add to this, to comment on the question? Social media is, we covered, but social media.
Social media is very important, and I would like to add to previous question about journalism and just information space. Of course, it's part of media education. It's part of our general impression about outside world. There is journalism, which is based on professional and ethical standards. It's information for public interest. It's information provided and arranged according to professional standards, independent sources, and all those standards we all know very well, but many people are not aware. And there is general information people share with each other. And it's important to define this distinction. It's important to understand what it is journalism. Journalism could be in social media. It is. Many journalists are very active in social media. But social media is not journalism as it is. So it should be defined. It should be understood. And after that, I think it's very easy to expect from social media some association with professional and ethical standards, and it's our future. I think it will happen because we are very fresh. We are in the very beginning of this process.
Yeah, thank you. Barbara, Bojan, that's, on the, I said social media platform, what are your views in terms of their roles, responsibilities, and specific measures that are being taken in the US? But also, what about fake journalists? No, what about journalists that are government promoted or pushed journalists who then attack specifically independent media? How can we support them, and how can we define this journalism? I'm thinking of journalists from state-owned media in Turkey, for instance, or in Hungary and some other countries. There's large examples, many examples.
Thanks, Roberta. Maybe I'll start on the two very complicated questions. Maybe let's start from the responsibility of the social media platforms, which is so IPI's position on that, and it has been our position, especially since the very beginning. We work around the world. We work with journalists in countries with extremely restrictive media environments, and we always remind people, especially whenever there are calls for for a regulatory framework in the social media platforms, we always remind people that in many realities, social media have been for many years the only space that independent journalists, critical journalists, and activists as well and so on, but in particular critical journalists had to disseminate information. Going back to the Arab Spring and these type of role that social media played there, but also many countries today, this is in many realities still an area that is less regulated than other aspects of journalism, and where independent information can still be disseminated. You mentioned Turkey. Turkey is certainly a country like that. Turkey is a country where many independent journalists are active on social media because that's where they can be active, and it's vital to have these avenues to disseminate information. In that sense, IPI's concern has always been that in the moment you allow social media platform companies to regulate the content, in the moment you actually ask them to do this, they would over censor what information is there in fear of having to face lawsuits, in fear of being kicked out of certain countries, and so on. So that social media platforms themselves would become the new censors. And this is something that IPI has always been very worried about. Now, we are also certainly, however, observing a situation that has been developed, and more recently, we do see that social media platforms have accepted restrictions imposed by certain governments and have themselves become the better censors in countries where governments have basically informed Facebook or even Google and others that either they censor information that is not convenient to the government, or they're going to be kicked out of the country. So in order to not lose their business interest in that country, they would become censors. So in this sense, it is a very, very complicated question, because on one hand, we don't want to lose these spaces. These are, for many independent journalists, these are the only spaces they have available, and we cannot afford to lose them. On the other hand, of course, we know also what is happening on social media. What is the solution? News organizations, quality news organization, legacy media, whatever you want to call them, have long been in conversation with social media platforms for two reasons. The one is that social media platforms, they also need quality content. They also need journalists on that in order to be successful. The other being, we also know that the advertisers have moved to the platforms. So the quality media needs the money that used to go to them and now has been channeled through to the platform. So in order to find a compromise through which some of the advertising income goes back to the news industry, there has been a lot of conversation between the industry and the platforms. Now, can these conversations lead to a situation whereby there is some level of supervision of the quality, some editorial control on the content disseminated on social media, but carried out by journalists, carried out by people who can do that because they're professionals, because they've learned it, because they've done it all their lives. So this is something we're looking at. This wouldn't be a regulatory framework, it would be a self-regulatory framework. Can we come to that point? And I very much hope so. At the moment, I personally do not see any other avenue for a regulatory framework that would promote quality information on social media.
Thank you. It's actually interesting because when we talk about social media, for the type of work that we at EFD have been doing for years, it has meant the role that social media platforms have played in terms of radicalization and recruitment to violent, ideologically violent groups and organizations. And in a way, when we talk about disinformation, that's the basis of it. And disinformation are the key elements that contribute to creating false narratives and potentially recruiting individuals. So it is clear that for a long time, government, international institutions have been looking at how to regulate the content while limiting freedom of expression. Frankly, I believe that there has to be some a level of responsibility from the social media platforms when it comes to what they circulate, because in some instances it is blatantly we're talking about blatant disinformation or fake news.
Sorry, if I may just add to that, Roberta, I may agree on some level of responsibility. We can talk about that, but however, let's remember that fake news is not illegal in most countries. So also that even a regulatory framework would not limit the dissemination of disinformation, because unless it is defamatory or, as you say, promoting extremism and so on, in most contexts, also disinformation is not necessarily legal. So I do think that we still need to look at other tools to do that.
Can we, as liberal democracies, use the same tactics of other countries or non-state actors when it comes to disinformation? We know that thinking about the World War I and II, governments and particular intelligence agencies, and I'm building here on a question from the audience, have been active in propaganda war to weaken the enemy. We're dealing with the war now, a very, very different type of war, but we are dealing with actors who are seeking to destabilize, weaken, and undermine our liberal democratic systems. What do you think our response should and could be?
Well, I think our systems are the problem. It's not, if someone's poking from the outside and the whole thing is becoming critically endangered, then something is wrong with you, because you would have thought this pretty unsophisticated development of someone spreading just nonsense and sort of toxic fake news on the internet should be a fairly random issue, but it apparently it isn't. I mean, to what extent it really actually influences politics remains to be seen. I've never seen a convincing poll about, whether these Russian paid ads on Facebook really contributed to some political changes in the West, or whether people voted one way or the other because they had some nonsense on the internet. So that also really needs to be factual. I think that the bigger problem is that no, I don't think liberal democracies can use the methods of autocracies. That I don't think, and I don't think we are at war for real, because in the Cold War, the United States and the Western Alliance was engaging in what they thought was positive propaganda. You had whole media set up for that purpose. Radio Free Europe, for example, which still exists, and I think it's an excellent media outlet, perhaps. Like Voice of America as well, and they were kind of broadcasting into the Soviet bloc, and mainly they thought they were broadcasting the truth from their perspective, and perhaps they were right. So nowadays, it's quite difficult because people, states, governments, even big private companies have lost the monopoly on news, on information, on commentary, on opinion. This is all being formed by what people find for each other on the internet, and as Nadezhda said, people look for what they want to find, and perhaps they find what they're looking for, and oftentimes the stuff we decide to follow on the internet in terms of consuming information reflects our own bias. So I think the whole setup has changed with the internet, and I wouldn't know how to get on top of that issue, because there is a sudden sort of, I remember in the 90s, we were thinking, wow, now everyone will become a genius, everyone will become a scientist. All the knowledge of the world is at your fingertips. You just log on in those days via your modem or, or your telephone. It was kind of dialing. And then you are connected to the World Wide Web. And if you want to find a quote from, Einstein, or you want to find a formula to create sort of a nuclear bomb, it's all there, and you can do anything. It turns out people are reaching out for rubbish. They're not turning themselves into self-made Einsteins. For the most part, they're not. Some people obviously must be. But how to deal with that issue, I don't know really, because there's no monopoly. How do you flag something as wrong? On my Facebook feed, I've seen things, in terms of disinformation, which has nothing to do with politics. For example, recently I saw this video by a supposed researcher who at least claimed to be one, and it looked quite serious. It was a sort of a teaching room, and there was a blackboard, and he was making a presentation explaining how humans are not made to eat meat. It was some sort of vegetarian movement or vegan movement that he represents. And it was obviously scientifically, it was all wrong what he was saying. It was literally fake news. But people who are living that kind of lifestyle and identify with the actual message, which is right. The moral message is one thing, the factual thing is another. And they will just think, wow, look, this is the confirmation that I'm quite right. Although it's nothing to do with science. It's presented in a certain way. And in the olden days, before the internet, you wouldn't have seen that on CBS or wherever on television. You wouldn't see, someone in the 70s coming up with a completely moronic argument, and he wouldn't make the news. He wouldn't be there. This person wouldn't exist in the ether, because there are checks and balances. But however, now you've lost that. Everyone exists in the ether. You've got Alex Jones, the great conspiracy theorist. He's just changing platforms. He gets banned for one thing, he gets to another. He's got millions of followers. Apparently, he has quite a good revenue as well. Although if you listen to what he's saying, after 5 minutes, you just think, this is like a comedy show. But obviously, everyone finds everyone sort of carves up their little space. And I don't know what we could possibly do about it as societies. So I stop there.
No, it's very true. I agree. We have echo chambers like we've never seen before when it comes to particular groups or particular issues. We're 4 minutes past the hour we've allocated. I would like to ask if you have any additional comments or concluding remarks, recommendations moving forward. There's no more questions coming from the audience, but please, if you want to add a few more comments, and particularly for me is really also recommendations. The situation is extremely critical. How can we remain ourselves? How can we respect our values and fight back and push back towards this form of destabilizing actions? So, Nadezhda.
First of all, I would like, do you hear me? Yeah. Yes. First of all, I would like to say that it's extremely important to share experiences. We live in the digital age. There is an illusion that we know everything, that we understand each other. Unfortunately, this is not true. And for me, today's meeting is very important. And I think it's important to share experiences, to share best practices, to share our achievements and our mistakes, and to try to elaborate a general joint platform for actions. It's important today. It's important for journalists, for those who work with information, for the audience, for everybody. And I'm very grateful for this option to start doing it. And I do believe it would be very fruitful for the future.
Thank you. Thank you for your, Barbara, I see.
Oh, sorry, if I have time, I just wanted to, you mentioned education before, and I think we all, everybody would agree that media education, media literacy education is key and is vital. But on the other hand, let's be very realistic here. We're looking at a post-COVID-19 reality where a lot of the quality media, a lot of the independent media, especially those operating in restrictive reality, are going to disappear because of the economic constraints. So what for do we need education if we don't have access, if we don't have the level of pluralism anymore that we need in order for the people to be able to access different sources of information and build their own opinions and participate in public life. So what the world urgently needs is to identify ways to ensure that a diversity of news media can survive this crisis. IPI has been in conversation at the European level, it's been conversation with the European Union and other authorities, but are we going to look at public funds in this area? Are we going to look at foundations funds in this area? There are many different models that are being considered, but we need to make sure that independent media exists, because we are going to lose many of them through the economic crisis that we're experiencing now.
Thank you. Thank you. That's it's very, very important and very important appeal because of the role that media can play in sustaining liberal democratic systems. So let me thank you on behalf of the European Foundation for Democracy, the US Mission to the EU, and the International Press Institute for taking the time to joining our experts. A special thank you to Nadezhda, who joined from Russia, Bojan from Berlin, and Barbara from Vienna, and of course me from Brussels. A special thank you. And we give appointments to you next week for another webinar on the issue of disinformation. We'll send an invitation shortly, or you might have seen it, is on the youth perspective on disinformation on the 11th of June. So thank you again for joining us all today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.